Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
You are not wrong, Chris Creddy. I'm all over the Nicole Flint story. I'll hopefully have an update before we break for Easter. Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's a look at tonight's story. It's coming up on Credlin. Pressure mounting on the government over Chris Bowen's ute tax has forced the minister today to eat humble pie and walk back Labor's goals. However, critics say it's putting lipstick on a pig. Consumers still paying big for Labor's emissions obsessions. The psychiatrist from James Cook University, he says the way we treat gender issues in children in Australia is, quote, a dangerous model. He's gone public on his concerns that he says could put doctors at odds with the Hippocratic oath to first do no harm. Dr Andrew Amos joins me tonight. Plus, more concerns about Labor's handling of national security, particularly on China, following confirmation from the New Zealand government that China was responsible for a cyber attack on their parliament. Former Deputy PM John Anderson says the situation is very serious. And speaking of community safety, as we near the end of this sitting week, the last, of course, before the May budget, Labor is once again chasing its tail to clean up their mess on the freed criminal detainees.
Yet again, we've been called to an early morning briefing by the government, who are in a panicked, rushed patch-up job to fix problems in the immigration law. And what I'm gravely concerned about is that they expect, having given it to us on a Tuesday morning, for us and the Parliament to pass it within 36 hours.
But first, the arguments against nuclear power, that it's too expensive and would take too long to install, are steadily being debunked. Ontario is the most important province in Canada. About 15 million people, and its main city, Toronto, is about the same size as Sydney or Melbourne. A key difference, though, between Ontario and, say, New South Wales or Victoria is that Ontario has much cheaper power. It's reliable and abundant, and that it gets most of it, about 60%, from nuclear energy. As the Ontario Energy Minister Todd Smith told Ross Greenwood on Sky on Sunday, and also Sydney Radio's Ben Fordham again yesterday, nuclear is the way to go. Now, I'm sure the last thing the Ontario Minister wants is to take sides in a political debate here in Australia. But what he said means that Labor's arguments against nuclear energy just do not stack up. Actually, the Albanese government looks increasingly silly on this, like yesterday in the Parliament when the Defence Minister Richard Marles was extolling the virtues of nuclear power at sea just moments after the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, had been attempting to debunk nuclear energy on land.
There is also a commitment of £2.4 billion over the next 10 years to expand the Rolls-Royce facility in Derby in the UK, which is where the nuclear reactors will be built for Australia's future submarines.
They have genius policy to put downward pressure on prices. $86 billion a pop for one reactor, and they want 6. Let's bring on the debate.
Geez, Bowen's a clown, isn't he? But as for the argument that small modular reactors don't exist, here's the Ontario Energy Minister, Todd Smith.
We're also at the forefront in the Western world in building a small modular reactor. Construction is already underway, and we're going to be building 4 of these 300 megawatt GE Hitachi BWRX 300s on site at the Darlington reactor just outside Toronto.
As for Labor's argument that nuclear power would take too long to build, here's Smith again.
We're building a small modular reactor right now at Darlington. We put shovels in the ground in 2022. We expect to have that small modular reactor producing electricity by late 2028, early 29.
And as for the argument that wind and solar are the cheapest form of power and that nuclear is the most expensive, here's the Energy Minister again.
Well, we have seen the previous government here in Ontario that went full speed ahead on renewables, and they were paying way over market cost for that electricity, 8 to 10 times more than what we say we're getting from our nuclear fleet. At 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, they were paying 60 to 80 cents a kilowatt hour for intermittent, unreliable renewable power from mostly wind and solar installations.
The Ontario Energy Minister makes the absolutely essential point that our Minister Chris Bowen always ignores, and that's that we need electricity all the time, not just when the sun shines and the wind blows.
Obviously this sounds elementary, but the sun doesn't shine at night, so your solar disappears at night. The wind sometimes and quite often only produces at night. Both of them have capacity factors, meaning they're there only about 25 to 35% of the time, whereas the nuclear facilities that we have in Ontario are there 94 to 97% of the time. They're there 365 days a year, 24/7.
Then there's the Bowen argument that we can't have nuclear power because we lack the regulatory regime, as if we could never manage what 30 other countries already have.
Our regulator has been a leader globally in working with other countries around the world, like Poland, for instance, that's looking to do the same thing that we've done in Ontario.
Finally, far more than needing more intermittent renewable power to attract industry, it's reliable power, in this case reliable nuclear power, that's attracting jobs and industry to Ontario.
And the fact that we have a 90% clean grid, one of the cleanest in the world, that is going to be expanding its nuclear profile, that we're seeing the massive investments that we're seeing here.
In the nearby province of Quebec, by contrast, that relies almost entirely on hydropower, Smith says this.
They're going to have an electricity and energy shortage in the next 10 years, and they're going to have to turn away investments because they're simply not going to have the power.
Now, as you know, I'm not in favour of closing down coal-fired power and failing to develop gas-fired power just because of emissions, particularly given our emissions are scarcely 1% of global totals. But if we really do have to get to net zero, and we want to must keep a first world economy, there's only one way to do it, and that's via nuclear power. Again, Energy Minister from Ontario, Todd Smith.
If we want to hit the climate targets that have been set by the federal government, that there's really only one way that you can do that, and that's with reliable, affordable baseload power that really only comes from small modular reactors or large reactors.
Is it any wonder that the Albanese government won't debate nuclear power, only demonise it, even though that's the same power they say they want for our future submarine fleet? Finally, look at these graphs showing the cost of power per kilowatt hour. At 14 cents, Ontario isn't the cheapest in Canada, but it's pretty good. Now look at New South Wales and Victoria at 34 cents and 29 cents per kilowatt hour respectively. That's a lot more expensive than Ontario. I reckon that makes it game, set, match for nuclear power. And I'll tell you what, if Todd Smith wants to challenge Chris Bowen for his job, I reckon that's a lay down misère as well. We'll go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
The government is scrambling to ram through tough new powers to jail immigration detainees who refuse to cooperate. It's a race against the clock. Wednesday is the last day of Parliament before a High Court hearing next month that could see another 170 people freed. Under the new laws, detainees who refuse to cooperate with efforts to remove them would face up to 5 years in jail.
Unfortunately, examples of non-cooperation with the government's removals efforts have been going on for far too long.
The Immigration Minister could also designate a removal concern country, likely Iran. That would ban citizens without ties to Australia applying for a visa.
The main objective of this designation is to gain the cooperation of that country in accepting and facilitating the removal from Australia of their citizens.
The changes passed the House and will now go to the Senate.
This is Labor desperately trying to outflank the coalition in a race to the bottom
The coalition wants to scrutinise the laws at a hearing before revealing its position.
Well, it would be very difficult to be able to support this without at least understanding the implications of what it is.
Next month, the High Court will examine whether an Iranian asylum seeker known as ASF 17 should be released despite not cooperating with attempts to deport him. If he wins, another 170 detainees in a similar position could also be freed. And Labor has watered down its vehicle emissions standard changes following growing backlash. Flanked by car makers and industry groups, Chris Bowen and Catherine King announced the backdown. The scheme will start 6 months later, emissions reduction goals have been softened, and some popular models, including Land Cruisers and Nissan Patrols, have been reclassified.
You'll still be able to buy the vehicles you know and love.
We don't have a target for EV take-up. We believe Australians have choices and they should be given better choices.
The opposition argues it amounts to a ute tax.
This very, very small tweak to get certain people over the line will actually see the prices rise over time.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Look, it's been a really big day in Canberra with that detainee issue rearing its head in the morning. I'm joined now by Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell, who was all over the drama. Lots of drama, as I said there, Andrew. That latest tranche of detainee legislation landed this morning, past the House, as we just heard from Trudy, off now to a Senate hearing. Oh, there's a whole lot of other issues we'll get into, but I mean, that has dominated the Parliament today, hasn't it?
It absolutely has. And I've got to say that you've got to remember Anthony Albanese came into the Parliament in 1996 and he saw John Howard do these types of things. I was here when the Tampa legislation, Kim Beazley was given a couple of hours to support it and he felt he couldn't. That kind of lost him the 2001 election because that allowed SAS soldiers to pop off anyone they wanted on the Tampa and not face any sanction. That was amended. But during that period, people had the view that Beazley was soft on asylum seekers. That was the end of him. This is from a similar playbook, Peter, I have to say. They had this legislation ready on Friday. No doubt they've been considering it for weeks. And yet Albanese basically at 5 minutes to midnight on the Tuesday before we rise Wednesday night says to the opposition, here you go, you've got to support it. We're going to pass it through the House by question time. We've got to get on with it. And I think it will pass the Senate tomorrow because I think politically the opposition will come to the conclusion it's wiser politically to support it. But they are concerned there hasn't been enough scrutiny of it. I mean, it's pretty serious changes we're talking about here. We're talking about, as we revealed, not letting anyone, apart from close family, in from Iran or Iraq at all, until those governments start to remove their detainees. Well, I think those governments will give us the bird, quite frankly. So I'm not sure this will even work. And also talking about if you don't allow yourself to be removed willingly, you'll cop a mandatory minimum of 1 year's jail or a maximum of 5 years. So pretty punitive. It's basically saying to people, some of whom might fear persecution, others of which just don't want to go home because they paid the people smugglers to get here. But you're saying to them, well, you can stay here, you just have to go to jail, that's all. And jail's a lot tougher than an immigration detention centre, that's for sure. So it's pretty full on in terms of a Labor thing to do. You wouldn't have seen Kevin Rudd do that in his first incarnation. I think we're looking at the left-wing Howard here, Peter.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, if it was a left-wing Howard, he wouldn't have had all of these problems manifesting itself from July last year through to, what are we now, almost April, and they're still bleeding on this issue. I think the problem here is they've got a knee-jerk response because they want to get it out of the headlines. We saw that with the legislation last year. The opposition had to amend it in the House. They had to amend it again in the Senate. I think the same thing's going to happen here. There'll be amendments put forward by the opposition in the Senate. I just don't think these guys are across the detail as they should be. I wouldn't be trusting the department because... I
certainly think there's the political fix element, isn't there? Because they did this at Christmas, right? They said, you've got to pass these preventive detention laws. Here they are. You've got 2 days to pass them, and they haven't even used them yet. So, there is definitely that political fix element.
No one out there in the real world is going to believe for a moment that Albanese and the Labor left are any tougher on borders than someone like Peter Dutton. So there's no chance they're going to get a win out of this one, in my view. And I reckon the reason they held it back, Andrew, is we went into news poll. It was in the field over the weekend. They know the Resolve poll. We'll get to that in a moment. It was out today. And I just don't think they wanted the headlines about another patch-up job on immigration and detainees going into a news poll count. I think they had bad numbers anyway, as we know. But
can I ask you then, if you were Peter Dutton now, would you just pass this and say to the government, well, if this doesn't work, it's on you? Or would you say, look, we're not going to be blackmailed like this. We're not passing this because, like you just said, people are never going to believe Dutton's softer on borders anyway. So which option would you go for, do you think? You know, probably not being over the detail of the hearing tonight, etc.
But I'd want the public servants before me to ask them questions as they're doing tonight, and that's a good move by the opposition. I'd want to make the law as good as it can be, and it's better to have a law that is halfway there, that's better than where you are now, than look for perfect with this government, because I think we are exposed as a country. And I say again, I mean, these boats start up again, the illegal migration starts up again. Any sense that we cannot get these people that we reject as refugees out of Australia, that we can't manage our borders and we'll end up being like the UK. I mean, it is that finely poised around the world. So I think the opposition's doing the right thing, not just politically, but I think they're doing the right thing by Australia. Let's go to those the Resolve poll out today, because this is where we've seen a drop in the PM's performance rating. Now, this one's interesting. He's moved from -6 to -11, which means he's dropped 50 percentage points over the last 18 months. So 50 percentage points since he was elected. Dennis Shanahan reminded us last night. Now, I didn't have this stat front of mind like he did, and I tell you what, it makes you think, doesn't it? No first-term government since the Second World War has increased its majority at its first re-election attempt. Now, to survive, the PM has got to do that. So how does he buck the trend of history, Andrew?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the campaign, but I do have to say these rules are made to be broken, aren't they? And you frequently see from the second to the third term, as we saw between 98 and 2001, as we saw between 16 and 19, a government increase its number of seats. So I don't see any reason why it couldn't happen, although it's not looking very likely at the moment. What I say that could happen, probably what they need to hope for, is just maintaining. They've got a 2-seat buffer. Maybe they can keep the losses to 2. That's what they'd be hoping. It's always been a race between majority and minority. And I think the concern for the opposition is they've never been ahead once. Now, I've covered plenty of these terms where the opposition's ahead for a lot of the term, frankly, and then the government comes at the last minute and snatches it. Well, the concern for Peter Dutton is he's never been ahead once, even though we've had this massive cost of living crisis. So both sides have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of issues, the government, and I know you would argue, well, this shows they're incompetent, and fair play to that argument. But they do seem to have an awful lot of issues and yet still not fall behind in the polls. So I think going against the opposition is the fact that Australians like to give a government 2-3-year terms before they turf them out.
I do think there is that predisposition there, but I think the issues at the moment are really playing hard into Labor's weaknesses. It's not that this is something that could be won by either side. The issue's gettable by both sides. I mean, all the sores for Labor, all the wounds are being opened up again, particularly on this border issue. I think that's what's driving these last two polls. News poll yesterday, obviously Resolve today. Hey, just quickly, transparency. Dennis Shanahan says there's a lot of problems with transparency. The government was elected saying they'd be transparent. We've seen anything but. I know you push them hard to get details for us most days here on Sky, but I mean, people are telling me when they go to consultation on legislation, they're even banning mobile phones from business people and industry groups. I mean, I think this is really paranoid behaviour, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't see any need for it at all. But what I will say is, in all my time covering politics, I've just seen hypocrisy over this sort of stuff with every single government, just about. They all come in saying we're all about open government and transparency. It's a lot easier from opposition, isn't it? When you're in government, you see a few realities, and
mate, can I tell you, in the Prime Minister's office, we did not operate on encrypted networks. Malcolm Turnbull and others did. We did not. Everything was there and FOIable. If you wanted a conversation that didn't get FOI'd, you'd have it face to face. But I have to tell you, I believe in transparent government. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Andrew Clennell. Right, let's get on to that detainees issue. At a high level, I reckon this is all about mopping up that mess. The government's panicked release of 149 foreign criminals into the community. They only had to release one, let's not forget, in that High Court decision. And we know a whole lot of activists are constantly challenging the courts. They're after, at the moment, the issue of the ankle bracelets and the monitoring of those criminals out in the community. The government still, though, has not put in one application yet to re-detain any of the people they have released. They are aiming to have these new laws through the Parliament, perhaps as early as tomorrow morning, ahead of a new case, the ASF 17 case, which will be heard in the High Court on April 17. And this relates to an Iranian man who claimed he's a refugee, says if he goes back to Iran, he'll be killed. But he was assessed and refused a refugee visa in 2017. He is also refusing to cooperate now with authorities. If he is successful, he and around another 100 other detainees could be released. So you can see why this is important. Where will it all land, particularly needing the Liberals' vote in the Senate? I'm joined now by Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan. Thank you for your time, Dan. I know it's a really hectic night for you. At a broad level, I don't think this could get any more shambolic than what we saw today. Am I right in saying that you only saw the bill half an hour before the government granted you a briefing at 8 o'clock this morning? What's the upshot of this legislation? What are they trying to get done?
Well, what they're trying to get done is they want to set up a new class of criminal, and then they also want to put in place a mandatory jail term if you do not cooperate with the government when they're seeking to deport you. Now, you're absolutely right, Peter. We got this legislation at 7:30 in the morning. We got a 20-minute briefing from departmental officials at 8 o'clock. And the Minister Giles and Minister O'Neill haven't done a press conference regarding this legislation. Now, normally what you would see is the legislation would be introduced, ministers would be out explaining it, but both ministers are in witness protection and will not go out and speak to journalists about it. It is one of the most chaotic things that I've seen in the 14 years I've been in the federal parliament. We have had to demand a 2-hour Senate inquiry tonight, which the government gave us. They didn't want to. We basically had to force that upon them to make sure there isn't unintended consequences. And then the bill will be voted on in the Senate tomorrow. But it has been quite an extraordinary day, and once again just demonstrates the dysfunction and the chaos and literally the inability of the Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, to be able to do his job, because he can't even explain and won't go out and explain what he's doing and the reasons for it.
Yeah, you're right to say that they were hiding today. I don't think I've ever seen it either, Dan, where there hasn't been a minister front a press conference and defend the legislation that they say is so urgent it passes in 24 hours, which is sort of at odds with all the usual processes in the parliament. But what I think is interesting here is they're racing out now and settling all these cases. They're trying to avoid the courts. They don't want to end up in the High Court, so they've let rapists out, yes, but also let the rapist take off their ankle bracelets, so there's no monitoring of them. They're saying to you, trust us, just pass this legislation. Thank God you've got your committee hearing tonight. But are you confident this legislation can withstand the legal challenges that the activists, we both know, are going to bring?
Well, that'll be one of the first questions we're asking tonight. Is it constitutional, and will it withstand legal challenge? Because what the government rushed through before Christmas, it now seems that they're not confident that it can withstand a challenge. And that's why they've taken an ankle bracelet of someone who's a convicted rapist. And that obviously is of grave concern to the Australian people. So that will be one of the first questions that we're asking tonight. And it's why we needed this Senate hearing. And it's why this morning I called on Minister Giles to have a press conference so he could go on the public record on these issues, because we want him and need him on the public record on these issues. That's the only way that he can truly be held to account. But he's just completely and utterly in witness protection at the moment. The fact that he hasn't done a press conference on what is significant legislation makes a significant change in two areas, especially with this new criminal class. He needs to be out explaining it, and journalists should have the opportunity to be able to ask these questions of him.
And look, it should be there with the Attorney-General too, given the constitutional questions around it. Hey, just quickly, is your predisposition to want to try and fix the mess the government's still mired in? Is that where you want to be by the end of tonight?
We want to keep the Australian people safe. That is the number one role of any parliament, and especially for us as an opposition when you have such incompetence. I mean, I now call it ultra-marathon levels of incompetence. We have to do the right thing by the Australian people from opposition, and that's why we want this two-hour Senate inquiry, so that we can grill officials, so that we can make sure there's no unintended consequences. As you know, Peter, the boats are starting to come again. We want to make sure that there's nothing in this that might encourage the people smugglers to start up their business model again, because that's the last thing any of us want to see. So there are so many things that we want to address at this 2 hours tonight. But in the end, we have to do the right thing by the Australian people, and we'll weigh up the answers that we get from this 2 hour Senate inquiry tonight, and then we'll make a decision tomorrow. But the Australian people can know that the opposition will do everything we can to keep them safe, even when the government, through its incompetence, is doing everything it can to keep them unsafe.
Well, I know you've got a long night ahead of you, Dan. I'll let you go. Thank you for joining us this evening. All right, after the break, a brave psychiatrist pushing back against the current approach we're taking with gender dysphoria and young people. He says that gender affirmation's letting down our kids. We'll speak to this expert after the break. Plus, Bowen's backflip on that emission standard. Lots of smiling faces at the press conference, but I don't reckon it's good news for consumers. We'll get into that as well. Welcome back. We'll get into Bowen's back down on those emission standards in a moment with senior motoring journalist Paul Gover. But first, last night I spoke about the welcome outbreak of common sense when it comes to the topic of gender and treatments for gender dysphoria. In the latest paper on this important issue, Dr Andrew Amos, a psychiatrist at James Cook University, has said the path we're on is incompatible with competent, ethical medical practices and could in fact run counter to the Hippocratic Oath. Dr Amos went as far as to say it's the responsibility of psychiatrists to ensure no patients are harmed by this dangerous model of care. Now, I wouldn't regard this as a radical sort of statement, but given the state of the world on this debate, we're at a point where common sense isn't so common. I'm pleased to say the very common sense-minded Dr Andrew Amos joins me now. Terrific to have your company, Dr Amos. I think it's really important. We throw around a lot of terms in this debate. I want my audience to understand exactly what this gender affirmation model is in practice, how it works, and just how prevalent it is in Australia, but what's happening with it around the world.
Thanks, Peter. Look, it's a fairly complicated model, so the international manual runs to a couple of hundred pages, but the key factor is in the name gender affirmation. So affirmation means that health professionals, including doctors, cannot evaluate the nature and causes of self-reported gender identity of confused kids and teenagers. So once a child presents reporting a gender identity that is different to their biological sex, gender services can then start them on the gender-affirming treadmill. So this starts with changes to their social relationships, and at older ages will often proceed to medical and surgical treatments that physically change their bodies. It's difficult to give a precise answer about the prevalence because the services that provide gender-affirming care have resisted calls for the release of their data, but freedom of information requests here in Australia have forced them to admit that the vast majority of gender-confused kids presenting for care in Australia will be treated under this model. It's also been a very dominant model around the world, although some places are starting to step back from it.
All right, I can't think of any other area of medicine where the patient gets to self-diagnose. So you're a psychiatrist. If I presented with anorexia, if I was of a very low weight but thought I was overweight, grossly overweight, you would put me into care. You wouldn't affirm that I was fat when I was very, very dangerously thin. Why aren't we looking at other options, mental health care for a young person that presents with gender dysphoria before we go down the path of just accepting what they say? I mean, we don't let a kid of 10 tell an oncologist they've got cancer without the doctor saying, well, yeah, you do or you don't.
Well, you've given a very good summary of my paper, Peter. Look, I argue in my paper that the model does abandon the traditional medical approach, which is assessment followed by diagnosis leading to treatment. So in place of that medical approach, the gender-affirming model of care substitutes a political goal, which is explicitly to increase the number of people identifying with a gender different to their biological sex. So, Peter, it should be noted that advocates aren't hiding this. They do state it directly in their documents, and they frame it in the language of human rights. So I think you're right to bring up the fact that other conditions such as anorexia nervosa, you don't provide treatment for those sorts of conditions without a clear diagnosis and good evidence that it's going to actually improve the state of the patient in front of you.
You are a brave medico who's put his head above the parapet on this issue. We know people get cancelled around the world if they just want to ask reasonable questions. You may have colleagues that aren't as brave as you. What's the general feeling in the medical psychiatry, at least, community?
Well, look, it's an interesting situation. There certainly have been people who've been, what I would consider, have been punished for raising the sorts of questions that we're talking about here. So Julian Spencer, a colleague of mine, was suspended from Queensland Health just for asking these sorts of questions. I think that's had a bit of a chilling effect generally amongst doctors and psychiatrists in particular. It seems to be fairly good evidence that if you stick your head above the parapet, it might get shot off. Despite that, I think when you talk to people, when you talk to psychiatrists and other doctors, there are quite a few people who are looking at what's been happening in the world and think, I have concerns, and they are reflected in the problems that I'm seeing. So, look, I think the tide is changing a little bit, but it's really going to take big changes in the system in order for people to be able to say, I agree with this, questioning this approach, and I think we need to step back a bit.
Do you support the idea that we have an inquiry, either at a state government level or a political federal government level, and get experts on all sides of this argument to the table to present evidence like they have in other countries?
Oh, look, I would strongly support, and I think it needs to be a national investigation. In particular, I think that would give cover to those people who have been scared to talk about their concerns. I've given some talks across the country, and individual politicians, for example, have said that they found it very difficult to move the needle on this issue as individual concerned politicians, but also parents. But the international scene shows that once we start looking at the evidence, the need to reverse the course is obvious and it's urgent.
Dr Andrew Amos, congratulations on your paper and thank you for your time and your bravery, I have to say, and your bravery. All right, after ongoing pressure from nearly everyone in the know, not to mention that huge back down out of the US, Chris Bowen today did a backflip. He has, well, are the changes enough? I think he thinks he's out of the woods, but a lot in the motoring sphere are not so sure. What does my next guest think? Senior motoring journalist Paul Gover joins me. Well, you're my best expert here. A lot of smiley faces in that press conference, a lot of backslapping. I think we had Toyota and Tesla there. But confirmation, though, Paul, that the cost of vehicles will still go up. And I guess my concern, we are a small market in Australia. Will we even get down the track? The right-hand drive vehicles we know Australians want to drive now. What did you think of the announcement? Did it hit the mark?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but the most important thing is they still haven't told us what the trigger point is for penalties for CO2 emissions, which is what this is all about, and what the penalty amount is. So it's terrific that Toyota was there, but I think that, and you would expect Tesla to be there, they're greener than green, you just ask them, they'll tell you. I think the significant thing is the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, which is supposed to be the peak body, were not there. That tells me they've been locked out. Mr. Bowen hasn't liked what they've had to say right from the start. And so they've basically gone direct to Toyota, which is the number one in Australia, and they're playing a game which Toyota will be able to guide them. But I think there are a lot of companies that are still wanting to see the detail, and they want to know how it's actually going to affect them. And most importantly, consumers, people buying cars.
I think the immediate response when he announced these new standards was, where's the modelling? Where's the modelling to back up these claims that driving these vehicles will be cheaper? We still haven't got that, have we?
No, and there won't be any modelling that says it's going to be cheaper to drive these vehicles, because apart from anything else, to get the cheaper fuel benefit, you're going to have to buy a new car. So that's pretty simple. If you've got an existing car, you have to buy a new car to get the benefit of the fuel. The other thing is, at no point has the government admitted the reason they're able to go ahead with this is because they, not the car companies, have finally caught up with the fact that we need better fuel in Australia. And the other thing that's interesting to me, there's been quite a lot of speculation that this has only come about because the Prime Minister has personally got involved. And what that tells you is probably that anything that resembles a so-called ute tax is not going to be a winner when it comes to election time.
Interestingly, that you, the motor expert, picked up that as well, because the politics of the PM getting involved says to me the polling is shocking, and something like a ute tax has caught on in marginal seats, and that's what's worrying them. Not that this is bad policy, it's just that it's bad politics. Just before we go, remind me this mechanism. You're saying that they haven't given the detail out today about what the caps might be. I want to make sure everyone at home can follow how this is supposed to work. Run us through that again.
Okay, so every vehicle combustion engine makes CO2, bad gas. And the thinking behind all this is that you have a trigger number, and there were 3 trigger numbers in the original proposal. Well, for simplicity, let's call it 200. And that's across the average of your whole fleet of vehicles you sell in Australia. And then there's a penalty, which was talked about being $100 for every gram you're over 200 on your average, multiplied by the number of cars you sell in Australia. So you get pretty quickly to a big number. If you've got a diesel pickup, for example, that emits 230 grams of CO2, that's 30 times 100 times the number of cars you sell. And that's the detail we don't have. And that's the critical detail, because that'll, even though they've wound their targets back by 20%, that's going to be the number that affects the retail prices of cars from the middle of next year.
Paul Gover, thank you for your time. There you go, CO2, not a bad gas, so we absolutely need it in the environment to survive as human beings. That's a debate for another time. All right, after the break, John Anderson. He's joining me to discuss very serious concerns that the Albanese government's asleep at the wheel when it comes to national security. Welcome back. Shortly, I'll get you some more details about the radical Islamist group ISIS-K as fears mount across other parts of Europe after that horrifying terror attack on the weekend in Moscow. But first, the Albanese government's record on national security does little to inspire confidence. Just recently, they've expelled intelligence chiefs from the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and there's growing fears a major strategic policy institute, which is properly critical of China, could be abolished. The immigration detainee debacle, well, that's been dragging on since last year, and 2 groups of asylum seekers have somehow managed to land undetected in WA last month. not to mention that legislative mess that I've just discussed with Dan Tehan. These are worrying times for our region, so why is Labor appearing to dismantle many of the security protocols established in the past that to date have kept Australians safe? Joining me now, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. John, thank you for your time. I mentioned briefly there the two intelligence chiefs, the head of ASIO, our domestic spy agency, and ASIS, our foreign intelligence service. Both of them have been thrown out of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and in their place, there's now the Climate Change Minister, and he's Departmental Secretary. Now, as a former Deputy Prime Minister, you sat in on the NSC. What do you make of this change?
This is chilling, frankly, and I don't say that lightly. I say out of concern for yours and my country and our viewers. This is extremely serious stuff. Our security agencies have done a remarkable job in this country of keeping us safe. It's a bit like eyesight. It's not until it goes wrong that you realise that you've made a mess of things. And we're now putting our machinery that's been so effective at keeping us safe and so effective at exposing bad policy, including in defence, frankly, we're putting it at risk. And I find that absolutely amazing. You too have sat in on those National Security Cabinet Committee meetings. You know how critical they are. And to not have the people who are most likely to have astute observations to make about potential terrorist acts within our country or without, present in the room when you're discussing the safety of the Australian people, the number one responsibility of the Prime Minister and the government of the day, beggars the imagination, Peter. It beggars the imagination.
What I tried to explain when I discussed this the other day, John, is the contestability that they provide when they're in the room. And I mean that if they're not in the room, ministers like you would get a briefing. I mean, I tell people at home, these could run to 30 pages. You read the briefing, you've got questions, but you throw it around in the room to people, the experts, who are not there to answer the questions. Now, yes, you could bring them up from the department. That may or may not happen. But to have them in the room and for them to challenge the advice of other experts, I think means the decision makers, which are the politicians, not the public servants, they get the best chance for all the arguments to be robustly tested. Without them in the room, that's what we're missing.
Absolutely. And now we've got a review into ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Initiative. Now, I should disclose two things. I was there when we set it up. Why did we set it up? We set it up because we believe that quite often the defence bureaucrats, and frankly, sometimes the brass, were telling us what we wanted to hear or what they thought we wanted to hear rather than what we needed to hear. We wanted contestability. The second thing I should say to you is that I'm currently on the council of ASPI. Now, it's been a very important body. There's a review into it. But what's really concerning is the government's got itself into a terrible pickle here. It has a tin ear. It should have realised what was going to happen when they called a review. You now have deeply informed people around the place, from the Australian, from independent news sources, indeed from Labor supporters saying this is because the government isn't too keen on having that contestable advice, exposing what our defence forces are doing right and what they're not doing right, what China's up to, what other foes are up to. They're not too keen on having that stuff. Now, that may or may not be right. We don't know what the review will recommend, but the fact is that the government's got a tin ear. It should have realised that immediately people are saying, oh, hello, this is one of the 14 grievances that China's listed. They don't like this particular think tank that is really the government's property and therefore the Australian people's property, and they're going to wind it back. The government's got a terrible problem here because any diminution now, perceived or real, in the willingness to support ASPI and take on board its advice will be seen as selling out the Australian interest. It will be welcomed by those who oppose Australia, and it will be met with despair by people who respect ASPI internationally, including the Americans, I might add.
Very powerfully said, John Anderson. Thank you. There you go, Australia, a bloke who was in the room backing both of those institutions, of course backing ASPI, but backing the Howard government, the Rudd government, the Gillard government, the Abbott government, the Turnbull government, the Morrison government model of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Now, whatever your views, whatever your politics, the way the NSC has been to date, but not anymore, has kept Australians safe. All right, after the break, who exactly is behind ISIS-K? And what's the worries for Europe over the summer? Plus another twist in the Donald Trump legal saga. More on that in a moment. All right, international issues plenty around. Joining me now, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Michael, I might start with you if I can. This terror attack in in Moscow, in Crocus City Hall, 130 people dead. Islamic State has accepted responsibility, but there's been some games played by Putin here. I'm interested in all of that, but also, who is ISIS-K?
Well, first of all, I've just come from Kiev, and I can tell you there are no Hamas demonstrations in Ukraine, so it's very self-interested of Putin to frame it like that. Mm-hmm. ISIS-K is the burning ember of Islamic State, and it's flamed into a terrorist bushfire, which may spread all over Europe. General Carrillo the other day at open testimony before the Congress said that he expects an attack on the United States in the last 6 months. Remember, just a few months ago, they killed 100 people in Tehran. So they're against Shiites, they're against Russia, they're against Europe, they're against anyone that is not their way of life, that wants to live in the 6th century, that is spread over this large part of Afghanistan that we abandoned.
And you know, this report today in the media that the Australian Intelligence Community, Parliamentary Committee, has been invited to go to Kyiv. You've just come back from Kyiv. Have been told by DFAT it's too dangerous, don't go. And we're one of a handful of countries that have not yet put back their embassy into Ukraine.
One of only 50 countries who've not returned their embassy. We're still cowering in Warsaw. Wow. Worse, Defence Minister Miles and Foreign Minister Wong are the only Western Foreign Affairs or Defence Ministers not to have visited Kiev in the 2 years of the war. Albo went. It's rubbish that it's too dangerous. The Intelligence Committee has a duty of responsibility to see where Australian taxpayers' money has been spent, and they should go there and ignore. There's a bias in DFAT against Ukraine that has existed for 20 years. I could go on, but I won't. Haven't got time in the program.
All right, what's the latest with Trump?
So of the 4 criminal cases that he's been, and civil cases that he's been facing, there's big news in 2 of them. The New York State case that was brought against him, the reminder, this was the one where allegedly the banks were not given a proper valuation, and so they gave him more favourable terms, but they have not alleged any harm. It's the state of New York that has intervened on their behalf years later and charged him. That had a $464 million bond that he has to post even as he appeals it, and it might go all the way up to the Supreme Court, the case itself. He doesn't have that kind of liquidity, few people do, and so there was a judgment just hours before the time would have come where the AG would have started seizing his assets. 1 hour before that, a judgment came down from the appellate court, which is the next higher up court in New York.
1 hour?
1 hour before the deadline, slashing it down to a measly $175 million, which he does have.
On the back of the couch.
Yes, he's a very wealthy man, so he does have that. He's going to post that and continue the appeals process. The other case, which is the Stormy Daniels hush money payment case, which is a criminal case, that his team was seeking a little bit of a delay, and he was granted a 3-week delay because the allegation was that the other side, the prosecutors, did not meet their discovery obligations, didn't hand over documents in time, so it's been delayed by 3 weeks. But I expect both are going to continue. Unlikely that there'll be a conviction before the election, though we never know. Or if it is, it'll keep going up to appeal, and I think it's strengthening him with his base because people see this as lawful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's strengthening his whole persecution argument. Just quickly, ceasefire, UN resolution in relation to Gaza. What can you tell us?
Peter, days ago in Qatar, the Israelis agreed to Biden releasing 1,000 Palestinian prisoners and 100 killers. Hamas refused. Now, after the US abstention on the ceasefire. Al Jazeera, the megaphone of Hamas, is crowing. The Americans are focused in the wrong way. The Houthis have reduced traffic in the Suez Canal to 40%, and we should be concentrating on the Iranians more. General Carrillo, the CENTCOM commander, in open testimony advised that he'd sent advice up to the White House how to calm all of this down, but he'd received no response.
Any chance that we're going to see these hostages released anytime soon?
I doubt it. Hamas refused the deal in Qatar when they got all of the extra prisoners offered to them. That's why I can't understand the American retreat on this at the UN Security Council, because there's no pressure on Hamas now. They're saying the tide of political events is going in their direction. It's made more likely, if you ask me, a military action in Rafah.
I'll leave it there. I'm sorry, both of you. That is sad news to end. Thank you very much. All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night back here at 6. Thank you for your company. Here's Andrew Bolt.